I want to hesitate how I say this, females can typically handle more volume. By this point, he's getting strong, 800-pound squat. But I told him, I was like, being strong is cool, but it's gonna come back to bite you later. Powerlifters' totals go up just as a product of doing a lot of these strongman type of lifts. You might be able to lean on linear periodization. Every time I come in the gym, I just put some 2.5s on the bar, add my 5 pounds, and boom, I just keep going up. But eventually, that's not really gonna work anymore. Powerlifting circles is very popular with this SBD type of training. Guys that are doing their main lifts multiple times a week. How do you squat 3 times a week?
What do you think is the mental code that's running in the heads of elite powerlifters?
I think with elite powerlifters, as well as just any kind of elite athlete, it's that will and that desire to improve, to be better, to be great, to achieve. Like that is kind of what's gnawing at a lot of them, you know, to when they get in a competition, whether it's beating their own numbers, whether that's getting first place, whether that's hitting this record, is driving them forward. And that drive forward is what, you know, helps a lot of these powerlifters to achieve these, you know, monumental feats of strength, is just that urge and desire to just want to be better, to want to progress.
What's the internal dialogue that you think it's going through their minds when they're like in a really high stake environment?
You know, to be honest with you, it depends on the athlete. Just as with every athlete, they're all people. Everybody is different. I've got a lot of, you know, athletes. I've worked with a lot of athletes to where they are more wired to be more highly stimulated. They, you know, the loud music, the getting hyped, the getting amped and flying out there and doing what they do, which is great to be able to have that switch. But sometimes with those people, we have to kind of like rein that in and teach them how to control that. Then we get other people who maybe they're not as much like that. They're a little bit more quiet, a little bit more calm, but they may struggle more with doubt and things of that nature, not unsure of whether they can do what they can do. So for them, it's that, you know, getting them more stimulated, getting them to stop overthinking what they're doing, and kind of everywhere in between, right? So everybody is a little bit different, but from my perspective, when we get in those places, those more high stakes environments, the nationals, the invitational meets, my recommendation is to always try and treat this as much of like a normal training session as possible. You want to be able to give an athlete a switch to be able to turn on and off versus being highly stimulated and not being able to come down, or versus being able to, like, you've tanked it and now you can't come back up, right? So much of it needs to just be regular old, not highly stimulated. We're warming up. This is just a normal day. But then before you go out there, boom, now it's time to flip the switch. Right. So is getting that athlete to be able to control and manipulate their intensity for when they need it. Right. When you're warming up, when you're 30 minutes out from your first lift, now is not the time to be bouncing off the walls. Right. Or when it's time to go out there, I'm glad you've been calm all day, but now it's like, I need you to wake up and like get after it. Right. So it's teaching them how to kind of get into that space, kind of wherever they normally lean from.
How do you do that though? For, let's say, it's the first time going to nationals, they're really nervous. How is it? Just exposure to that kind of environment, or do you have any tactical advice that you can give them?
A lot of it is exposure. From my standpoint and from like a psychological standpoint, arousal is very touchy, right? Like it can really improve performance, but you know, with adrenaline and other things like this, it's got a shelf life and it's not very long, right? So talking about flipping that switch and teaching an athlete how to and when to flip that switch is really important, because when you're going off of adrenaline and high arousal, like it only lasts for so long. You can't keep it there all day long. And when you're at these national competitions and everything like that, unless you're at it and you're just seeing the highlights off Instagram or whatever, like you don't realize that meet started at 9 a.m. and maybe they're going until 6. You can't stay hyped up off a pre-workout and, you know, whatever it is that whole time. So a lot of it is just being able to teach them how to be calm, teach them how to basically have a routine and a structure. And even from like a cognitive or a mental performance standpoint, what does your imagery script look like? When you walk in the gym, you put your bag down, you get your shoes out, teaching them to be able to control their arousal by controlling their emotions until it's time to flip that switch, right? So depending on who that athlete is, what kind of exposure they've had to that, some are a little bit, I don't want to say easier to work with, but you do a little bit more massaging of that, right? You see that, hey, strength is not this person's problem. It's mental. They overthink themselves out of things that they know that they can do. Or like this person is, they've got strength off the charts, but they don't think enough. They're bouncing off the walls, and I need you to like calm down and pay attention to what you're doing, your technique on the lift or whatever, right? So a lot of it is, and we were talking about this earlier, engagement. You got to know your athlete. Sometimes, especially nowadays, that can be a challenge because we do so much virtual training. Not everybody that we work with is right in our backyard now. So how do you engage with, get to know that athlete? A lot of it is, watching training footage, engaging video calls, phone calls. If you're working with athletes in person, getting around them and kind of getting to know their personality. How does this person tick? If this person is very much like, hey, what are we doing tomorrow? Like, is it this percentage? And I was wondering if I could do that. Like, they're very just high strung on what's the plan, wanting to know and wanting to control. That might be an athlete that will think themselves out of doing things that they can do, right? I got to learn to let this athlete like, hey, don't worry about all the fine details. I need you to just show up and be ready for whatever's there that day. Throwing little things out there, teaching that kind of person how to be flexible versus the other person's like, hey, coach, like, I just felt good today, so I maxed out. What are you doing? That is not on the program. I'm glad that you felt excited that day and it felt great, but teaching that person how to rein it in, teaching them, hey, in the structure of this program, this is when we kind of have our peaks and our valleys and intensity. So when you want to do that, I think that's great, but let's save that for these days, right? So how you're going to psychologically work kind of with the athlete is going to depend on where you need them. I need them kind of down the middle, being able to call audibles at different times. So if they're a little too far left, I got to reel them back to the middle. If they're a little too far right, reel them back to the middle. But eventually giving whatever athlete that I have tools to add to their tool belt to use in certain situations, right? There are certain situations to like, it's time to turn up and like empty the gas tank. And then there's other situations where it's like, it's going to be more beneficial for you to use restraint right now. So that way we can live to lift another day or whatever it is. So that's, I think that kind of comes into it is how are you actually coaching that athlete? It's not just X and O's on a program. You're developing a relationship with that athlete.
In your experience, how do they deal with setbacks? Because normal people don't, they have a different way of coping, right? But what about your athletes?
I think at some point, it's a little bit of an acquired skill. I think in training, I typically try to promote as positive and a successful environment as I can, right? I don't like athletes missing a lot of reps in training or a lot of failure. Like you want to positively build them up and get them in this space. But sometimes to learn how to fail gracefully or learn how to like have a short-term memory and bounce back from a setback, you kind of have to experience a setback. At some point, something has to punch you in the mouth. That's a wake-up call enough for like, what are you going to do about it? And again, dealing with that athlete is a lot of it's individual. Is that this athlete that you've been working with, somebody that's maybe new to where their confidence is a little bit fragile at this point. So they make a mistake, they miss, they have a setback, whatever it is. Maybe they're ready to unravel. And you as a coach being in that situation realize that like, this is not the end of the world. Like if you get back on track, we could salvage this. Then it's a lot more of, hey, don't even worry about it. It's no big deal. Build them up, like get back into this place. Other athletes can use that as motivation to, okay, now I got a chip on my shoulder. Now I really need to kick it in. And sometimes it's lighting the fire up under somebody's ass to get them to turn it on, right? Like, hey, they came to the meet, their warm-ups looked a little slow, they're just kind of like not hitting, and they go out there and maybe they miss their opener or something, right? And then instead of them, coming in the back and being all poo-poo about it, me like, oh, it's okay, you'll get it. Now maybe that's the opportunity to be like, are you awake now? Like, are you ready to go? Like, let's turn it up. Use that as an opportunity to try and motivate that individual. But again, it's know your people. It could go either way, having those tools. But at some point, it's about taking that feedback, that failure, that hurdle, whatever that was, as long as you're not injured, right? Like that's a completely different scenario. But if it's, hey, I missed a lift, or I thought I made the lift, but the judge gave me a call I wasn't anticipating. Like, a lot of it is, we talked about earlier, being calm, being able to regulate your emotions, being able to, okay, you missed a lift. Let's not freak out about it. Let's calmly make a decision on what's the best way forward. And a lot of times as a coach, you kind of have to be that filter, that emotional filter sometimes too. Because I feel like sometimes it's not even what you say as a coach. Sometimes it is your vibe or your energy. That athlete of yours just missed a lift that they always make. Do they see me freaking out? Do I look surprised? Do I look upset? Like, they're reading off of that. So it's about me very much having like a poker face and being able to, process what needs to happen now. Does this athlete, are we really in trouble? Do I need to adjust numbers? Do they need to, calm down? Do they need to wake it up? Like, what needs to happen? And then from there, then I can kind of filter that. Okay, here's what I need to do. It's not necessarily manipulating that athlete, but again, at some point is knowing your people to, I need a certain response out of you if you're going to be successful in this, or not have this obstacle come up again, right? How do I approach that with you? But it's also to that athlete too, is teaching them to be calm enough in that environment to take and process that feedback. This is not a moment where you freaking out is going to help out the situation. This is a moment to where we're going to take a deep breath. And between coach and I, we came up with, okay, we're going to adjust this weight, and boom, we're going to move on and catch it on the back end. Done. End of story. We've moved on. As opposed to, you see a lot of athletes, like, they'll get on a narrative about something and they're just dog on the bone. They won't let it go. They missed a squat and they're, 2 attempts into deadlift. They've already gone through bench and like they're still on it. It's like, let it go. The lift is done. We're, 3, 4, 5 lifts past it, and you're wrecking the rest of your performance because you're still on that thing that happened. So it's about, again, being able to work with that athlete to really control your emotions, your thoughts, and just kind of be compartmentalized in how you approach a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, you mentioned injuries, right? Like, how do you help them with injuries?
My biggest advice to most athletes is like, you're going to continue to progress at a very consistent rate as long as you don't get hurt. Now, if you do get hurt, it's not the end of the world, but do realize like now you got to take a couple of steps back, right? But again, as with anything, like we talked about those hurdles, like what happens next? If it's a little tweak, if it's a, oopsie, and then we can just throttle back a little bit and then get back on track and then address the issue along the way, that's best case scenario. Like, we could work with that. Sometimes it's just a little slap on the wrist to let you know, like, okay, something has to change. Or it was just a freak thing that happened. Oh, I was loading weights and it slipped out of my hand. I dropped the plate on my toe. No one can help that. But if it's a, hey, this hip flexor that's been bothering me, like it finally came to a point and I felt a tug today and now it hurt, right? There's probably something that's going on either with my programming or on that athlete's end. Are you doing all the mobility that we talked about? With no, okay, like your body is telling you this is what needs to happen. If you're going to keep training at this level, your body is giving you tips and signs and things like that, right? So again, trying to get that athlete in the perspective of injuries a lot of times is a feedback mechanism. Your body is talking to you. Maybe we try to do something too fast. Maybe, analogy that I give a lot of times with people is like you're driving around with the parking brake on. Like, yeah, you could do it, but something's not working the way that it should. And you is like a ticking time bomb. Something's going to happen if we don't clear this up, right? So then from that athlete, again, it's just you got to manage your emotions. If you're hurt, you're hurt. Like if this, comes down to, hey, I got to pull out of this competition, or I have to change my training for a period of time to address this. You getting in your feels about it is not going to change anything. It doesn't change the injury. Getting these athletes very kind of compartmentalized in that sense of, okay, you're hurt. That's fine. We're just going to take this as an opportunity to address what needs to be addressed. We're still going to train whatever it is that we can, as much as we can. But the thing that needs to be addressed, that's what we're doing. Like, I'm not a physical therapist in that sense. Like, a lot of it depends on the injury and severity and whatever. But again, it's a problem to be solved. It's something to be learned from it. And then we move on and we get to it. This is how, or that mentality is really the reason a lot of times that people get hurt. People get hurt. I don't want to say a lot, but frequently enough. But the people that bounce back from it have more of that mentality of like, okay, how do I get back from this and make sure that this doesn't happen again? Versus the ones that don't, kind of almost have that victim mentality of like, oh, woe is me and it hurts and I can't do this and I can't use, squat with this knee. And so now I just not been working out and sitting on the couch and eating ice cream, binging on Netflix. There's a lot of other stuff that you could have been doing besides working on that knee. Like, you got a whole nother good leg, you got a whole upper body. Like, a lot of it's that mentality of like, are you going to bounce back from this? Or are you going to let this consume you and change your whole narrative? Like, you may have to adjust your timeline 100% if you get hurt off of what you were originally trying to do. But just as with, using the GPS analogy, traffic comes up, there's an accident, like, it happens. Doesn't mean that you're not going to get to your destination. It just means it's going to take longer. Or you might have to detour, but then you get back on track versus like, pack it up, turn around, go home, like it's done. A lot of it's that mentality.
This is a story that relates to it, where she had an accident at work and she broke her ankle. She was like on a boot for like 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't seen her in a while, right? Until like a few weeks ago. And she took her shirt off and she was so jacked.
Yeah.
Like, so much muscle on her upper body. I was like, that's so cool. So she just took that opportunity to get stronger. And we hear stories like that too all the time. We're like, where they just worked on their weaknesses, or they had they were able to get another advantage from somewhere else because of that setback. So it became like a blessing in that sense.
Absolutely. And I think the real key with it, whether we're talking about powerlifting, a different sport, or just kind of like fitness in general, this is one of the areas that consistency and effort is rewarded over time, right? So you could take some time off, and sometimes planned time, like, you should take that. Like, it's not going to kill you, right? But at some point, the people that keep doing this again and again and again, and day in and day out and day in and day out, that's how you get to the top of the mountain. Well, I got hurt. So what? Like, find a way to keep going. Like, there's a proverb out there, a buddy of mine, we say it a lot, but a guy was talking to a monk on how to get enlightened, and the monk told him to chop wood and carry water, and that would you get there. He said, okay, well, whenever you get to enlightenment, then what? Will you still chop wood and carry water day in and day out? Like, you don't get to stop. Well, I got hurt. You're still training. Well, okay, I finished the meet. Okay, well, what's the next thing? And the people that are successful tend to be the ones that can leave themselves enough breadcrumbs, continue to let goals evolve or pivot or whatever, and just not stop going, right? Even people that, oh, well, they did CrossFit, but they went to this, they went to that. We talked about, Mark Sanchez earlier, in high school, he was playing football and running track. And then he went into the Army and was doing Army stuff. Then he was powerlifting, and now he's doing pro strongman and these kinds of things. He kept training the whole time, just the focus shifted, but you could see the evolution and strength and these other abilities because he just never stopped. Just the focus changed ever so slightly. So with individuals that are injured, it's really no different. It's them finding a way to motivate themselves or talk themselves into I don't feel like doing this today, or this hurts, or I'm limited in what I can do today. And that individual that says, okay, well, what can I do? And then do that until they get back to a place, and then they continue. But there's a lot of things. That's the tough part, is there's a lot of things that can distract you and get you off that path, or keep you unmotivated from continuing to do that. And that's the secret. Like, you're not motivated all the time. You just have to find a reason to get it done that day, regardless of what's going on.
Well, one of the tenets that we have here is just brick by brick.
Yeah.
Just keep doing it. Keep
100%.
stacking up those bricks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you seen someone flip from being just an enthusiast to a serious competitor, and how did they do it?
Not anyone is like immediately jumping into mine, but just from like a theoretical standpoint, let's just say that, okay, I'm a general lifting enthusiast. I played sports in high school or in college, and maybe because of an injury or just not being able to compete in that particular sport at that level anymore, got to a point they couldn't compete in that. But, I started working out. I started doing some other things. But they had this potential, or kind of like this untapped, or like, I used to be a high level athlete in this area, but now that I'm not on that, then all of a sudden they do something. And then it's like, oh my gosh, like, this person was just like dabbling around and now they're like amazing. It's like, they didn't just start from nothing and like, turn into something. Like, there was probably some kind of background or high level in one area, and then you transition to something else, right? We talked about, Mark with the powerlifting to strongman to this, that, and the other. Yeah, you could say before, oh, I was just dabbling in working out, because he never competed before, but it doesn't mean he never trained those lifts in the gym. It just means he never pulled the trigger and actually got, official with it. So I think that's probably more common, because like I said, with that type of mentality that you tend to find in athletes, not that other people can't have it, but you tend to find them in athletes, is that they're always going to give themselves a reason. They're going to leave breadcrumbs for themselves. They're just going to say, okay, hey, I played this sport in college. Maybe I was a rower. Well, what does one do after college rowing is over? I don't know, but I work out a lot now. But now all of a sudden somebody turned me on to this sport, powerlifting or strongman. And like, turns out like I'm still pretty athletic and I'm really excelling in this area, right? But there was some level of like, they did something well first and then they went to something else, because there's always that urge to, okay, I'm not doing this anymore, but what's the next thing? What's the next thing I could get into? That constant search until you say, okay, this sounds good. And then you pour into that, and then what's the next thing? But generally, from my experience, you don't see somebody that's just kind of like, I go to the gym sometimes, and then all of a sudden turns into some phenom randomly. You know what I mean?
One of the stuff that stands out with CrossFit in our sport is like, now that I've been talking to a lot of swimmers, and the swimmers in our gym have just like this insane conditioning, and they're just really, really good at CrossFit.
Absolutely.
I mean, they can hang really. The recovery is insane. That's the thing. It's like, you go up to the top, like red line, normal people, it'll take a while for them to go down, but the swimmers, they're like ready to go again.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, that background that they have. And you see this with a lot of like very high level CrossFitters too. Like, even before CrossFit got really big, and then they seemed like they just jumped into it and they were great. But, well, what did they do before that? Oh, Rich Froning played college football, and this guy did this and that, and gymnastics, soccer, like something came before this, and then now they just tuned in their focus. And sometimes for some athletes, it could be interesting in the fact that like, you can do a lot of things athletically, but as with any sport, there's going to be certain advantages, right? Like, you don't have to be tall to play basketball, but sometimes if you're tall, that can be helpful, right? Now, you don't necessarily have to pick a sport when you're coming up that you're the best at that sport. You could just like it, but sometimes you get into something that's like, oh, wow, I never really knew that I was this equipped for this thing, because I never really tried it before. Like, I had no idea I'd be so good at deadlifting. I just always had these really long, lanky arms. And now this person taught me how to deadlift. And, after like a couple months, I'm like deadlifting 500 pounds. Like, what do you know? Like, sometimes you're built for certain things and you just didn't know it because you hadn't like pushed it. But lo and behold, there's training comes and those adaptations come over time, right? You're not going to go from not training to just being amazing usually, unless just genetically you're just some freak. Like you've probably been doing something before. But
For powerlifting and strongman, what kind of sports do most of the really good ones come from?
I've noticed a lot, not always, but a lot of like strongman competitors, especially at the higher levels when these guys are kind of going pro and stuff like that. Like they're huge. They got these big body types. Like it's nothing to see these guys walking around 6'4", 6'5", well over 300 pounds. Like these are big men. So then you start looking at like sports that have that kind of body type, and you tend to find like, oh, throwers, like shot putters, linemen, or maybe linebackers, like football comes up. Maybe sometimes rugby, like those things tend to like translate over well. And then with that too, a lot of those sports that you named, track, football, rugby, those types of things, those sports typically require you to lift too. Like they have strength and conditioning sessions. So some of these guys may have found that like, oh, I'm actually pretty good in the weight room. And, it preps me for my sport, but now I'm not playing my sport. And now I just get after it more in the weight room. And lo and behold, now I can get even stronger now that my focus is just on the lifting aspect versus, well, I got to be able to run and agility and right. So, those things can kind of happen with that. As far as powerlifting, um, it depends on the lift, right? You'll see sometimes people with longer arms, big hands, things like this. People say, "Oh yeah, they're a born deadlifter," or those types of things. Those people can tend to be longer, leaner individuals, but typically those shorter, stockier individuals, if they're coming from other sports, wrestling, sometimes football, sometimes even track, um, the benchers and the squatters, right? The kind of short, torso, stocky, like they're going to be able to generally handle a lot of weight, partially just for the fact that they don't have to move it very far, right? They're just a little bit more short and compact. So, as with any sport that kind of has people who tend to do well with like a certain body type, it can kind of translate over to strength sports, depending on what you're talking
How about let's go one by one?
about.
Bench, squat, and deadlifts.
Mm-hmm.
What are some like the body styles that are like advantageous for those movements?
Specifically for bench press is usually going to be the individuals that are little, not necessarily shorter, but they have more of a stocky build, more of this bigger individuals, because that's another thing too, and that I've found and a lot of other people will kind of subscribe to is that typically when numbers on the bench press start going up, like your body weight is very tied to that, right? You look at a lot of big bench press numbers and you start kind of seeing body weights, correlate, right? There's not a lot of guys that weigh 175 pounds that are benching well into the 400s. There may be some here and there, but not very many, right? Body weight is tied to that. So these bigger, stockier body types tend to be better. Again, you'll find exceptions, but the shorter your arms are, the less distance that you have to move the bar. So you're shorter, stockier arms, more of kind of this bigger barrel chest. Those guys tend to be very good on the bench, especially when they start training and really start to magnify some of those things that make them good at bench already. Like, well, I already had this stocky body type, and now that I started lifting, my muscle bellies are just, a little bit shorter and, I get fuller. And so now when I didn't have to press a bar as far, now I have to press it even less distance because now I got this big barrel chest and big arms and everything is just moving this big weight, right? For squats, to be honest with you, a lot of guys that bench press pretty well, as long as they don't have knee problems and stuff like that, usually end up being pretty good squatters too for the same reason. There's not a lot of people that kind of have like the short T-Rex arms, but have like long legs, right? That would be weird. I'm sure there's somebody out there like that, but generally shorter arms, stockier build, the legs are going to kind of go with that too. And when you don't have to move that load when you're squatting as far, everything's a little bit more short and compact. Typically, and this can be developed through training or just, again, anthropomorphic, like if you have that bodybuilder type of very narrow waist, abs chiseled out, it's not necessarily going to be the most advantageous thing for squatting, because when you get into that hole and you got a lot of wiggle room in there, that's not doing you any favors. But now all of a sudden the guy's got, you know, a little bit of belly to him and can kind of, you know, fill up that space and kind of sink in there like a glove and rocket you out of the hole. Now all of a sudden this is the guy that's putting up big numbers on the squat. So typically that little bigger, thicker frame, thicker limbs, arms, legs, even torso is going to be more advantageous for that. But oddly enough, then when you throw in the deadlift, things start to flip a little bit. That same guy or girl that was tearing it up on squat and bench because they were nice and short and stocky, they're coming down to get a deadlift bar and things aren't looking so sweet anymore, right? Now the guy that can, you know, scratch his kneecaps without even bending over has the advantage because he doesn't have to move the weight as far picking it up off of the floor because of his limbs, because of the size of his or her hands, you know, if especially in scenarios where hook grip becomes a deal, right? Talking with Chris, I remember working with Chris, and I said, well, why don't you hook grip it, man? I can't, I got these little thumbs. And sure enough, I look at the, yeah, you're gonna have a hard time hook gripping. Let's stick to alternator, right? But things like that tend to make people more of a natural deadlifter. Do you still have to train it? Yeah, of course. But the little bit leaner, longer frame tends to be a little bit more advantageous for deadlifters. So again, you know, with some of that stuff, whether it's strongman, powerlifting, the goal of that athlete is to really kind of understand, like, where are you good already? Like, where do your strengths lie? And as much as you can, like, lean into your strengths, because from a powerlifting standpoint, that's building up your total. You do still have to address your weak points though, but you kind of got to know where you're at. Like if you know that you're a strong bencher and a strong squatter because of your body type, that's what you like to do, that's what you're good at. Yes, you still need to be able to deadlift, but you know, you better get a head start on squat and bench and beating most of these people in the meet, because they're going to be, you know, running at you fast from behind when we get to deadlifts, right? Or if you know that, hey, I'm a big deadlifter, I'm not as, you know, big of a squatter, I've got these long legs and, you know, long femurs and whatever, okay, well, you better be able to just squat enough to stay in the mix and bench enough to stay in the mix, so that way you can catch them on deadlifts. So, you know, it's about realizing where are your strengths and leaning in. Same thing goes for strongman. Strongman even a little more so at times, because you've got more events. You've got more areas, and strongman goes off of points, right? So you don't even necessarily have to get first place in every event in order to get first place for the meet. It's going off of points. So you can strategize a little bit more. So it's really about, you know, every athlete has a toolbox. Some things you can add. You can add things like work capacity or more tissue, you know, hypertrophy or things like that. But at some point, that athlete is who that athlete is. You can magnify that a little bit, but you're not going to turn that, you know, skinny kid at 18 years old who's, you know, 6'3" and 130 pounds soaking wet into, you know, a 300-pound monster. It is probably not going to happen. He just doesn't have the genetics for that. Now, hey, you know, maybe that kid that's, you know, in 9th grade that's already 6'3" and 240 pounds, like, that's the kid that's going to be this probably big, strong man, big bodied lineman thrower. Like, you could see it coming. So some of it is just, you got what you got, lean into it. Or just take on the challenge of like, hey, maybe I'm not really built for this, but I like the challenge of being able to go against the grain. I never thought I could be this strong. Like, I've always been kind of skinny and whatever, and never thought I was strong, but let me see how much I get. Great, or do that. But, you know, you're going to have to kind of realize that, especially with this and in life in general, everybody's got advantages. Everybody has things that make them good at what they do. So, yeah.
I was actually watching a video. This was a while ago. I didn't know anything about strongman until, I mean, I used to watch a while ago until I saw some of the events where these guys are sprinting. And I thought it was just like powerlifting where it's raw strength. But I was like, you need conditioning with this. It's similar to CrossFit. Big guys moving big weights as fast as possible, and you need like conditioning. Like that's quite a
And
feat,
a lot of
actually.
those events are, it's for time. You got to do this for a minute. So now it's heavyweight and not a powerlifting where, okay, do it one time and let's see what you could do. This may be heavyweight and you got to keep going nonstop for a minute. And if your gas tank is emptied after that, well, good luck doing the 5 other events that you got coming on the rest of the day. Or even, I've seen this too at some of these higher levels, some of these invitational events. It's not a one-day competition. This is multiple day competition. So if you get into a certain placing in one day, okay, great, that opens you up the next day. Well, if you just gassed out in this first day and you got nothing left, you're not going to do well that second day. So yeah, it's a lot more of a conditioning element. Um, I, Not necessarily the best athlete, if you could say, in terms of change of direction and agility and jumping and stuff like that, but definitely more athletic in the traditional sense than something like a powerlifting. Powerlifting really focusing on that static element, and that max effort type of strength versus strongman. It depends. It depends on the show director. It depends on the lift that they're doing. They do have sometimes to where it's, hey, 1 rep max, you work up as much as you can on this event. But then they may have others that it's max reps. They have other movement events, and you're looking at 5 or 6 different events in one competition typically. So, being able to, have a bit more of a gas tank recovery, things like that come into play. But interestingly enough, most of these individuals aren't any less strong because of it. So it's kind of funny. I myself have really started to venture a lot, unless we're really in like a meet prep type of scenario, for some of my powerlifters that compete. Um, a lot more of their training is looking almost kind of like this hybrid between like a strongman and a powerlifting because of that very thing. I've seen powerlifters' totals go up just as a product of doing a lot of these strongman type of lifts or infusing those type of elements within their training, because it helps to balance out that profile, right? You've got push, pull, squat, hinge, carry, lunge, like all these type of things that the body does and how it can move. And so when you pick 3 of those elements and you focus on them exclusively, you may be leaving a lot of other things on the table. Not necessarily saying that strongman goes and just checks all the other boxes, but it does check more than powerlifting. So as a byproduct, some of those things come in handy. If your work capacity is better because you've been doing more than 5 reps a set on stuff, then you can increase your volume. Well, if you can increase your volume, you can get bigger, then you can get stronger. Like all these things kind of help funnel back to strength in general. But strongman tends to focus more on general strength and general movement patterns, hence with the shows always being different, movements kind of, versus powerlifting is more that specific strength. Doesn't matter what federation that you go to, you're going to do a squat, a bench, and a deadlift, and there's going to be 3 attempts on each, and you got to max out on all of them, right? Like they may have little nuances, but it's generally the same versus could even be the same federation, the same show, promoter or director, and it's going to be completely different from one show to the next. So being able to be strong in general and being able to exhibit that strength on whatever's in front of you that day, right? So that type of strength is obviously for strongman, that's their bread and butter. But I've noticed not only for powerlifting, but for a lot of other things too, soldiers, other athletes, that whole just be strong and show up and just be able to do whatever's in front of you, eat whatever's on your plate for that day, that tends to bode well for most things, right? So you tend to train somebody in that way and then just say, oh, you got a powerlifting meet coming up? Okay, cool. Like we'll get a little specific for about like 8 weeks, trim it down, and then boom, go do that. Oh, you're in the military, you got an AFT coming up? Okay, no worries. Like we'll polish that up, throw a little running in, 8 weeks, boom, you're good. Like that, I'm strong enough for whatever's in front of me type of mentality. It helps a lot. So I'll definitely tip my hat to strongman for that, just kind of perspective that they keep.
What's the most fundamental knowledge that every coach needs to know and needs to know about strength? And if they don't have this, their athlete's going to have a low ceiling.
Honestly, this is probably like one of the biggest pillars that, like, if you don't have this, like, you're gonna be stuck. It's just progressive overload. It seems very simple. It seems very basic. But if your program, your athlete, whatever, is not employing some measure of this progressive overload, and then when you throw in this periodization element, progressive overload over time. If you can't get those two things down in some form or fashion, like, you're going to be in for a rough time. Like, you're really just going to be spinning your wheels. Now, there's a lot of different ways to skin that cat. Linear periodization, block periodization, undulating, types of intensities. But that's really just kind of slicing the relationship between volume and intensity. But at some point, that's where it all kind of comes in. As the volume starts to pick up, the intensity's got to go down to match that. As the intensity goes up, the volume's got to go down to kind of counter with that. So, when we start talking about programs and things like that, that's just really like the basis of, you include a lot of different exercises and formats and different splits and multiple days a week. But if you're not finding a way over time to consistently overload the body, give it a, basically a better or greater stimulus, then your athlete or are just going to be on the hamster wheel running in place.
I'm guessing it's a little trickier for a strongman, since like there's a lot of types of events that you're working with, that you have to prepare for.
Definitely. Because strongman by nature follows more of like a concurrent type of model of training, meaning that you're addressing multiple, adaptations at one time: speed, conditioning, strength, power. All those things go on in any one workout or in any one competition. So a lot of it boils down to, with anything, really a simple needs analysis. And depending on that sport, that may have to be done more frequently than not, right? You should always kind of be checking, evaluating, and then adjusting based off of the feedback that you're getting. That feedback could be in the form of competition. Okay, you're powerlifting. Well, how did you do it this last competition? Oh, I PR'd by this, that, and the other. Okay, well, obviously the program that we were doing was working well. Let's keep doing more of that, or find out where our weak points and address those and whatever. But finding some way to continually evaluate that process to make sure that you're moving forward.
So let's talk about periodization specifically. Can you give us like how does it actually work? Like the blah, pretend like I'm a 5-year-old.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of periodization, okay, you're manipulating intensity and volume over time to get some result, right? Result or adaptation. So typically when we start thinking about those adaptations, we're talking about power, strength, endurance, hypertrophy, our muscles getting bigger, fat loss, things like that. Something that we can tangibly see that I want to get more of this result. So I need to do some action in between, right? So not necessarily the nuts and bolts in terms of the exercise and the sets and the reps, but generally speaking, we're going to need certain things to be able to fulfill those adaptations, right? So obviously for strength, we need to move some heavy weight more often than not in order to get stronger, right? So that means that when my intensity or my load start to increase and my volume has a decrease, that kind of lets me know when I want to get stronger, kind of the ballpark that I need to play in. If I want to get bigger, if I want my muscles to get bigger, put on more mass, more size, build more muscle, I'm really kind of in like this middle intensity type of range, and my volume is moderate to high if I want to be able to grow. So that kind of sets the stage for that. So when you zoom out on a macro standpoint, you really got to figure out, what do you need and why? This is where the periodization starts to come up, because now you start putting a time frame on things. It makes it really easy when you compete, because now you have a set date and you just work backwards from that date. Okay, I'm going to spend in a certain chunk of time prepping for this competition. So I'm going to have a peaking phase, and maybe that's going to be 4 weeks, and then I'll back up and I'm going to do some strength before that, just general building strength. Maybe that's 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And then before that, I'm going to, work on just general foundation, building some size or working on these weak points. Maybe I'll do that for 8, 12 weeks before that. Now, all of a sudden, you start to develop this macro plan like, oh, well, the next 16 weeks are kind of like planned out. And then you start filling in the middle. So that's really where that periodization is coming into play, is the time element, because you're starting to notice like, oh, okay, when I'm starting to build my foundation, building muscle, building those movement patterns, and say it's powerlifting, the squat, the bench, the deadlift, just really laying that foundation, I notice that my intensity is kind of moderate here, right? But then when I start to, and my volume is higher, and then when I start to transition and go into strength, then my volume drops, my intensity goes. And then when I start to peak, now my volume's really got to go down. So I got to realize all this strength that I've built, and then we peak coming into a competition, whatever. Well, what happens if I'm not competing? Fine, just pick your time frames. Pick a goal. You don't necessarily have to sign up for a competition to compete, but the whole point is to check, test, retest, evaluate, is what you are doing working or not, right? That should be done frequently, every so often, right? That could be every 12 weeks, a couple times a year. It depends on your sport. It depends on your goals, but whatever the goal is, you're going to set up your program around that. Multiple goals. And this kind of gets into the different ways of being able to structure that. I kind of put it in a way that would be more of, it almost sounds more like block periodizations, where we're focusing on certain elements or adaptations for one block of time and then moving on to the next in like a logical fashion. But as you bring up things like strongman, well, what happens when you got to do a lot of different things and be good at a lot of different things at once? Well, now that system of, well, okay, we're getting bigger here and we're getting stronger here, now they merge a little bit more, right? Now we get bigger and stronger in one session, but then we just have to evaluate, okay, bigger and stronger how? Like we may be able to do a lot of things or train a lot of different variables, but still, what's the priority? I can train a lot of different things. I can keep things on maintenance mode. I can move it forward, but something still has to take the priority. Well, it's off season. I'm like 16 weeks out from anything meaningful. Okay, well, maybe we need to fill out your weight class, or maybe we're whatever it is. Now hypertrophy is a priority. We're still going to layer in some strength, but now strength is like 5s and 6s rep range wise. Strength is 80 to 85% right now, not 90, 95%, triples, singles, right? So the face of that may change a little bit, but now we start to squeak that in. So essentially that periodization is manipulating those variables over time to get said result. Some of these adaptations, we talked about this earlier, you're kind of rewarded for your consistency. You can't put together like a week of training, like, dude, I killed it this week, and now I put on 5 pounds of muscle and my lifts all went up by 15, 20 pounds. Like, nah, man, this is going to take the better part of like 6 weeks to create complete a training cycle and start feeling like, wow, I feel a little bit more comfortable with these movements. I feel a little bit stronger. I went up maybe like a pound or 2 on the scale. It's like slim pickings, but that's by design. You got to stretch this thing out over time, because a lot of times too, this up and down and making real quick progress and diving back down again is what creates that yo-yo effect. We all know those people that they don't work out or exercise consistently, and then they do, and they like lose 10 pounds real fast, but then they plateau and then they fall off and that kind of thing. This is more so one of those. It's like, yeah, you maybe in 6 weeks, we only increased your max on this lift by, or maybe in 4 weeks, we increased this max by 5 pounds. Well, 5 isn't very much on your bench press or something like that. It probably wouldn't work like this in real practice, but let's just say hypothetically. But if you did that every month for a year, now you just put 60 pounds on your bench. Now that's something completely different. But through periodization is we're going to figure out how we get there. Because when you're a beginner, you might be able to lean on linear periodization. Every time I come in the gym, I just put some 2.5s on the bar, add my 5 pounds, and boom, I just keep going up. But eventually that's not really going to work anymore. And then maybe we say, okay, well, maybe we do some reps this month. We go 10s and I'm increasing strength, but more so in this range. And then we go to 8s and 6s, whatever. Like, that's where those different models of periodization will come in. Some is just every time we're just adding on a little bit more. Some are looking at a snapshot of, hey, this rep range and this adaptation. Some are, non-linear periodization, to where this session we came in and we worked on hypertrophy. And the next session we came in, we worked on strength. And then one after that, we worked on speed or endurance. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it. I won't necessarily say what's right or what's wrong. Again, they're tools. What is your athlete going to respond best to? What does the sport kind of dictate?
What's the other? You said linear periodization. What's another one that you use? I'm guessing they're more for advanced athletes.
Yeah, I would kind of say advanced athlete. It helps because I feel like they can. Athletes that have experience or are more advanced, they tend to do movements or have seen a variety of movements and can do a lot of movements and things proficiently. May not be great at everything, but you could throw something at them and they pick on like pretty quickly, right? So for certain training styles, something that's concurrent, right? So in one training session, we may be doing something for power. Okay, we're doing jumps or throws or cleans or something like that, right? And then we're going into strength. Okay, now we're gonna do pause front squats for this, that, and the other. Then we get into our accessory work and maybe it's split squats and pull-ups and whatever. You don't necessarily have to be advanced, but if you've never done a front squat before, or you can't really do a pull-up, or you've never done a clean or kind of throw like that, you're going to spend most of the time just trying to figure out like what you're doing rather than being productive and like moving the needle. Oh, I PR'd my pause front squat by, 15 pounds from last time I did it. You got some people, I've never even done a front squat, let alone a pause front squat. Like what are we talking about right now? So certain things you have to kind of fit it, or that style's got to meet that athlete where they're at. Sometimes for an athlete, they just need very simple, just progression, like where they're at. We're just gonna do the same thing, but just do a little more, do one more rep, do a little bit more weight. When I deal with my kids that I worked with, my daughter, she's 9, so we're not getting into all this, funky bands, chains, different variations. I'm like, baby, you gotta learn how to squat. And we're going to squat and we're going to do it again and again and again. And maybe if I'm feeling spicy, we throw a pause squat in there. But it's to get better at squats, you're going to squat. Sometimes it's more reps. Sometimes it's a little bit more weight, but it's very basic. But I'm trying to teach a pattern. I'm trying to develop that skill. But if you've got somebody that's been squatting for, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, we can go past the basics a little bit. And we can get into some things that, not just for entertainment value, but that can kind of unlock little areas of performance that maybe a beginner doesn't necessarily need to worry about, right? Like for a beginner, doing front squats may just tax the upper back enough to where you don't have an issue with it for a while. But that's because their front squat or their deadlift or whatever it is maybe only, 135 pounds. When you front squat 400 or 500 pounds, you got different problems. Just doing that alone is not going to help your front squat anymore. It's got to be, I got to do this other variation that targets this, or I got to do a lot more upper back work so I don't lose my rack position or whatever it happens to be. So a lot of times I feel like one plan is not necessarily better than the others, but you need to know your athlete or what you're getting into. And you can even have a particular style that you like to work out of, right? It's conjugate or whatever. But you still, as a good coach, I feel like you have to have enough flexibility to, if you have a system that you normally do, you got to be able to modify or progress that up.
How does conjugate works again?
So conjugate works primarily by training multiple adaptations at the same time, whether it be in the same training session or the same week. So a lot of times, powerlifting wise, is especially this West Side barbell conjugate, split gets thrown out and everything. So you got 2 max effort days and you've got dynamic days and everything like that. But really what they're getting at is you're training speed or power, you're training maximal strength in the repetition effort method, you're training basically hypertrophy all within the same week or training cycle.
Maxing out twice per week, something like that.
Potentially. This is where the coaching and the programming really comes in, because you could run off the rails real fast with something like this. Then when we talk about, some systems that may not be built for a beginner per se, or you're going to need to modify some things. So yes, a very advanced lifter may be quote unquote maxing out or coming very close to that multiple times per week. But with that type of system too, it is also highly encouraged for more advanced athletes to rotate exercises. Well, why? Just to have fun and just try different things? No, to either stress weak points that you exhibit in your, core or main or indicator lifts. It could also to keep the wear and tear off of the body, right? I could max out on front squats on one day, but maybe like total load wise, maybe that's 300, 350 pounds. That's way different than maybe somebody maxing on the back squat that maybe squats 500 or 600 pounds. Just on your central nervous system alone, that's a different type of stimulus. So while, yes, I maxed out this many weeks in a row, you can potentially, if you're programming intelligently enough, offload different things, or, hey, we're working singles today, but we're coming and doing triples this day. Like you can manipulate it, but it basically gets down to you are working strength or maximal strength on a consistent basis. You can rotate the mode, the exercise, the, things like accommodating resistance or whatever to facilitate that. But again, there comes that periodization. This is not just, let me just pick, this many different lifts and just max them all out. Like, hope this goes well. There's thought into it, knowing that, hey, I can do more on a back squat than I can on a front squat, but I could do more on a safety bar squat than I can on a front squat. So if I order them like this now takes my volume to a certain place, right? Again, not always set up for the beginner, but there are ways that you can work around that. Maybe a beginner is not maxing out on singles, but maybe each time that they come in there, hey, we're working up to 5 reps on your squat, and we're going to come in and we're going to do it again, and then we're going to do it again. And then on week 4, maybe we're going to switch to pause squats. Same general pattern, but we're going to work something else different in that pattern. Maybe we're going to switch the tempo. Okay, maybe now 5s, we're going 3s. We've been back squatting this whole time, but I can introduce other elements that are going to add to them being a more proficient squatter. Well, that doesn't look very West Side and bands and chains. No, it doesn't, but it's the same system of, for this young of an athlete, or young maybe in terms of training age, not necessarily just chronological age, but for this type of athlete, this will help build and develop strength. Trying to put too much load on the bar too frequently is going to crush them. The point is to develop strength here. Okay, now I have a portion of my workout or a completely separate day where I'm working on hypertrophy. Maybe for a beginner, it's total body work. It's maybe 3 sets of 10 is just enough to get the needle moving. But you got somebody who's been training for 10 years, 3 sets of 10 on some basic stuff might not do it. We may have to get a little bit more creative in how we force the body to adapt and, create that responsive hypertrophy, get bigger, get, whatever. Obviously nutrition, things like that will, float in there. But again, I think it all comes down to this periodization, intensity, and volume, whatever. It's having a game plan, having a system or a structure to be able to accomplish these results that you want.
For powerlifting, because I know in weightlifting, for a block, it's, well, theoretically, let's say we start with 60, 70, and then deload back to 60, and then you go up, and then the third, and then you go back, like you go higher on a 70. That's like one block. How does it look like with powerlifting?
Comparing it to Olympic weightlifting in that sense is very comparable. The only thing that I would say that might be a little bit different in that scenario is your percentages or the percentages that you're working at for powerlifting may be a little bit higher, because powerlifting, you don't necessarily get any points for speed. If you don't do Olympic lifts with speed and force and power, like, it's not going to go. Versus with powerlifting, like, you can grind it out as long as you get from point A to point B. Doesn't matter how fast it was, as long as you get there. So that's where stuff like Prelipin's chart is going to come in, right? Prelipin's chart or table, basically, it kind of goes over the relationship between volume and intensity. There's a lot of studies done in, Eastern Bloc countries with certain amounts of volume compared to certain amounts of intensity. And basically they gave certain ranges. So, hey, at 65%, on the low end, this much volume, on the high end, this much volume. This is kind of the sweet spot though for this, amount of volume and intensity, and on kind of down the, block 65, 75, 85, 95, whatever. This was all done on Olympic weightlifters though, but the same system can be modified for powerlifting, just knowing that your percentages may be a little bit higher because you're not having to lift quite as explosively. But kind of the same thing, certain programs are powerlifting wise are more similar in that linear context to something like a 5-3-1. In week 1, we're doing fives and we go, 65, 75, 85%. And then the next week we go 70, 80, 90. And then the week after that, we go 75, 85, 95. And then we slightly increase our training max and then we recycle it all over again, right?
And you just do that, like, let's say you got a 16 week to train for your work for a competition. You just do that. How does the peaking looks like towards the end?
I mean, you can, like, here's the other thing too, is something's going to come down to, like we talked about, how advanced is this lifter? What's the training age like? You could take a very beginning type of lifter, somebody that's younger, not been lifting that long, and pretty much keep kind of the same script for 16 weeks without making too many modifications, and they're just going to kind of keep getting a little bit better each week. But for an advanced lifter, you're not going to keep doing the same thing for 16 weeks. It's not going to work. There's a certain tolerance that gets built up from training that long over time. It's kind of like the same reasons why you're making results is the same reasons why you're not making results. You know what I mean? We laugh about it, but it's kind of, the guys messing with each other on, who could drink more. Oh, dude, I can drink you on the table, and like whatever. It's a tolerance thing. If you drink all the time, you could drink large amounts and still be able to like keep it together or do it for longer. It just as a byproduct is you've done it longer versus, the newbie, the lightweight, take like a drink and like they're falling off the bar stool. It's the same thing in terms of with exercise selection, volume, certain intensity, stuff like that. You get a newbie that's never maxed out before and you have them maxed out, they'll be freaking wrecked. But, somebody else has been doing that for a little while. Okay, boom, they bounce back. They're good. They're ready to go. I'm not as sore anymore because I always do this lift. I've been doing this lift for the past month. And some of that is by design. Some of it's to make you more efficient at certain things. Why do we squat all the time when we powerlift? Because you need your body to get really used to squatting and being a more efficient squatter. With this bar, that bar, and the next, doesn't matter, be a good squatter, right? So you can do that from a linear standpoint with a lower training age athlete. And then that peaking process as you're coming into a meet or whatever, just basically is an extension of where you were already going, right? So if peaking was 100%, to keep backing it up weeks. So when that client comes to you and, hey, I have a powerlifting competition in 12 weeks. Well, have you competed before? No, I've never really competed before. Just been lifting for maybe 6 months, but I want to. Okay, cool. So we're going to test in the beginning, or if they've just got a recent, hey, where are your numbers, where are your maxes, whatever. It didn't have to be a 1 rep max, but something to put you in the ballpark to where we get this, okay, if this is 100%, or this is what our goal is, if your best is 200 pounds and we want to hit 220 in 12 weeks, 100% is 220. And then the week after that is 95%, and then 90, and then, right? You just plop it right on there.
So you base it off of your goal.
Within reason. So, like sometimes as a coach,
You can't
you
just
have
say
to be
300
really,
pounds, you know?
yeah, no. Sometimes people, oh, I only put 50 pounds on this lifting. Well, how long you got? 8 weeks. It's not gonna happen, right? But I think if you could be realistic, if you could take where they're at and somebody increasing a lift, you know, 10%, 20% over a training cycle, like that's a big deal. But again, keep those numbers in mind, like in the level that somebody's working at. You talk about 20%, if somebody hits, 200 pounds on a lift, 20% is 40 pounds. Like that's a lot, but for a newbie in a training cycle, like it's not unheard of. Somebody just by a product of like learning how to be a more efficient deadlifter, training their core and, just a regular training cycle as a beginner could put on 40 pounds of training cycle. But what about the guy that pulls 600 pounds, right? 20% is 120 pounds. You're not putting on 20% in a training cycle, probably not even in like a couple years. It's not going to happen. So being realistic about what does that end state look like? But once you've narrowed in on this is realistic, this is the goal, then work backwards, right? This even really comes to, in your attempts and your warm-ups and everything like that. If you have a max of 500 pounds, 10% jumps are 50 pounds. That's throwing, a 25 on each side and just boom, 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 popping it out. If your max is 100 pounds though, that's only a 10 on each side. So it's all kind of like relative. Like when you're just starting out, you're going to make progress a lot faster. You can say, hey, I want to put 20% on this lift and it may be doable. And then you just kind of like clockwork. You just work it in there. You just work it backwards. And that's why it just seems like almost anything works when somebody's new and fresh, right? But eventually you're going to get to a point where your body's like, nah, I've seen that before. Or, hey, you remember this one thing, this mobility thing, or this weak thing that you haven't been addressing? Well, we're not new anymore. So I'm not dealing with it anymore. And then all of a sudden, oh man, this hip flexor's kind of been hurting. I don't know what's wrong. Like I'm trying to get my squat to go up. Well, what have you been doing? Well, I just squat more and more and more. And I just been doing 5x5 and I just been squatting and it's not working anymore. Well, you may need to do some single leg work. We may need to do some iso. Like then you start to get to this point of like, and this kind of comes back to my philosophies in the sense of minimal effective dose. Don't give anyone any more than they really need at the moment. Why would you give a beginner, this super complicated, conjugate, accommodating resistance, like all these, different variables? Well, all they need, just squat for right now. Until we get to this point to where that's not working anymore, or we've drastically slowed up in progress, why would we do anything else? Because eventually we're going to get to a point to where that's not going to work anymore. And I got to have another option ready for you, another stimulus to like get you back rolling again. So if I throw the whole kitchen sink at you right now, what are we going to do later? Right. But eventually at some point, some people, let's just take somebody who started playing football in high school, right? You've been lifting weights since you're 14 years old. You're 30, 35. You've been lifting for 15, 20 years. Like you're well past the point if you've been training this whole time, right? Or you've been training fairly consistently that like, you're just going to put a barbell on and like just keep piling on weight each week. We're way beyond that now. So this is where I feel like these other types of periodization, these other elements of like, what other variables can you add in to stimulate the body to get some more juice for your squeeze? I've done all these basic things to get stronger. Now what's the next step? And I think that that's an important principle because this type of game, the strength game in general, is an evolution. You may have started off doing 5-3-1 and you're a power lifter and worked great for years. It doesn't mean that it's a bad program when it stops working. It just means that like now you just need to move on to this next thing, right? Like it is going to evolve. You're going to need different things to keep going. The same reason why you went from a 200 to a 300 pound bench is probably not going to be the same thing that's going to take you from a 3 to a 400 pound bench. It's going to change. It's going to evolve. Sometimes that means the training system needs to evolve. Sometimes life just happens. And where you used to be able to train 5-6 days a week, and life happens, work, family, kids, whatever. Now maybe you train 3 times a week. Now your training split changes, but these things change. But again, like we talked about earlier, it's like, how can you continue to, you know, chop wood and carry water? Keep just going and going and going, right? Well, when I've done this and it doesn't work anymore, okay, now I'm going to pivot. I'm going to add in this. I'm going to try this. And this is where you get to people that have trained for a long time. Sometimes they can do really cool things. Maybe they do really cool exercises. They lift a lot of weight and whatever, but it's just a product of, you know.
So we talk about linear, and you said conjugate. Is there another one or a few more?
Yeah. There's a few more different styles or ones that are like popular. So for example, like block periodization is another one that's like pretty popular. To where you're really just focusing in on one type of adaptation for a blocker period of time, right? So if I'm going to focus on hypertrophy for the next 4 weeks or 8 weeks, that's pretty much all that I'm doing. Like I'm just going full on bodybuilder machines and, you know, the 8 to 12s and the everything that goes with that. And then when I say, okay, I've done all that, now I'm going to transition to strength. Like there is a logical transition from one block to the next. It wouldn't necessarily be something like, hey, I just finished this endurance block and now I'm going to go straight to the strength block. Like you haven't really laid that foundation in between yet to be ready for that, right? But there's a logical, okay, hey, from, you know, endurance to hypertrophy to strength, from strength to power, like a logical shift. But this is going more so in blocks of time or in concentrated blocks of training on one thing. That can be really good when, you know, you've got something that you really like want to focus on. The issue with that sometimes though is that like if you spend a whole period of time focusing on one thing or just a couple of things, what about those other things that you haven't been focusing on? Those start to diminish over time. That's the thing about training, as with anything else, is it's really a sliding scale. Some of the people that are extremely strong, they're extremely deficient in certain areas, right? Maybe it's mobility or conditioning or work capacity. Some other individuals that are really high in those areas, work capacity, you know, mobility, like whatever, strength wise, they're down here, right? So it's a sliding scale of these different abilities and adaptations that you get to choose what you want to do, or your sport or whatever will dictate what you need to be successful for those things. So then it's about, you know, trying to set it up in a way that is the best for your sport. So it allows you with that block periodization to focus solely on something for a period of time versus, you know, when you're doing something like a conjugate or concurrent mode of training, you're focusing on a lot of different things, whether either in the session or the scale of the week. So either you really better know what you're doing and it doesn't take as much not concentration in terms of like focus, but concentration in terms of like that being the sole thing that we're working on, this training block, you know, being that, hey, maybe I'm already at a good size. I'm already close to the top of my weight class. Like it's definitely good to get this form of training in, build the tendons, do other things, but like is not something I need right now. So maybe I don't need a whole block to just focus on this or that or whatever.
How do you communicate to your athletes that if you do this block, sure, you're going to get deficient temporarily in one area of your fitness, but you're going to get strong here?
Sometimes it depends on the athletes. I'll be honest with you. You have athletes that are very maybe cerebral, where they want to like understand the process. They want to understand like, why am I doing what I'm doing? Like, how does this get me closer? Like whatever. And I think that for those types of athletes, there is kind of like this education that goes on as to like, this is why we do what we do, or this is why we're doing what we're doing. This is where we're trying to get to. Here's the intent of this block. Here's the intent of this training session. Here's the intent of this set. This is, you know, if I'm working with them one-on-one, a lot of it is about, if you understand what you're doing or why you're doing what you're doing, you're going to work harder at it. Some athletes are this way. Others are like, whatever, man. What do you want me to do today? I'll do it. Right. But sometimes those are nice. But for me, I really feel, and this is a little bit more overarching than just, powerlifting or strongman or whatever. This is kind of like just a personal mission type of thing, is that like, I feel like I kind of very much have that spirit as like an educator at heart. So anytime I'm doing something with an athlete or whatever, whether they stay with me for, a few months or a few years or, indefinitely, I'm always trying to teach and like drop gems and jewels. So that way, like, if you ever do go in a different direction on your journey, or, you kind of leave me, you go a different way, like, I want you to leave with something. I want you to leave with something tangible. So I tend to be one of those that's like, I like them to understand the process. Hey, why we're doing this, I want you to do it like this, because when you squat, this. Oh, okay, makes sense. Hey, we're doing this many reps because at this point we're this far away from our competition. So we're gonna gradually, like, I like them to know what's coming. Because this is the training and the programming and getting the results that we get. Like, there's nuances to it, but it's not magic. Like, it's not smoke and mirrors. I want them to know that there's a formula to this. And as long as you generally adhere to that formula, you're generally going to get these kind of results. Now, of course, there's other variables. How much did you sleep? How much did you eat? Stress. That I can't control everything, but generally, if they do a decent job of some of those other things, nutrition, sleep, stress, whatever, and then they stick to what we've laid out, they're pretty good. The ones that don't care, whatever, man, just whatever you want to do. It's fine. I think it works. It gives me the ability to just like whatever however I want to do it, I could do it that way. But at the same time, though, it's almost a little bit confusing to me, because it's like, I don't want to care more about your goals and your progress than you do. If you don't have a real, like, concrete reason for being in, I don't know, whatever you want to do. Like, I don't know, you could do it. I just don't feel like you'll stay doing it for very long. Now, that's something that's completely different than like, hey, I really want to get to this point. Now, I trust you to like whatever you want to do to get me there. But I do want to get here. And at some point, there's going to be a reckoning of like, what we were doing, did it work or not? Right? Not just like, whatever flavor you want today, coach. Like, I'm just here because I got to be here. Let's make it entertaining. Like, that. Okay, it's better than not doing anything. But for me, I don't care for that too much. Have an opinion on something. At least we could have a conversation. Well, coach, I don't like barbell lifts. Okay, that's fine. Like, we have a conversation. Maybe we don't have to do that based on what you want to do. But just because you don't like barbell lifts doesn't mean that we're not going to squat. Doesn't mean that we're not going to hinge. Doesn't mean that we're not going to push. It just may not be this. Based on what you want to do, okay, I can live with that. Cool. Or, hey, man, I know you don't like squatting, but you're the one that came to me and said that you want to powerlift. So, too bad. Like, we're going to do it. Yeah. And your squat is trash, so we're going to do a lot of it. I'm sorry. Like, those are kind of like those areas of like, you want to be able to, get to that point with that athlete to, be able to make that call. But
so linear,
or like concurrent.
And then you got block. And there's another one that I Googled that I don't remember on the top of my head.
So it's probably nonlinear periodization. And this is kind of what you'll see a lot in powerlifting circles. Is very popular with this SBD type of training or squat, bench, deadlift training, in terms of guys that are doing their compound or their main lifts or variations of those lifts multiple times a week. Okay, well, how do you squat 3 times a week? Well, you don't if you're going to max it out 3 times a week. But where they get away with it is that they'll undulate the intensity.
Undulation, yeah, that's the word I was looking for.
Undulating or weekly undulating periodization, right? That's so something like a West Side would be daily undulating periodization, meaning that the intensity undulates or changes from day to day to help with recovery and things like that. Hence why they have a max effort day. They've got a dynamic day, right? Heavy weight, lighter weight, but for speed, and then hypertrophy mixed in, right? Or with this SBD stuff, hey, well, when I squat on Mondays, I squat more for hypertrophy. I do 4 sets of 8 at 65, 70%. But then on Wednesday, I squat for speed. I do my speed squats. I do, 6 sets of 3 at 70% with, I don't know, some chains or something like that. I don't know, right? And then on Friday, I keep my volume low, but I work up to a top triple and then do a couple back offs at, maybe 10% behind that. So I squatted 3 times a week, but the way that I did those squats, the intensity that I used undulated from day to day. That helps me to be able to promote recovery while still being able to improve movement quality. How you get good at something? You do it more often. But that can get a little bit tricky if you're doing it often, but you just keep like in a linear fashion going up and up and up every time you do it. Like, well, on Monday, I did 200 pounds. And then on Wednesday, I did 205. And then on Friday, I did 210. That's probably only going to last for so long. Like, keep going through that, right? But if Monday has its own progression and Wednesday has its own progression, Friday has its own progression, now I can squat 3 times a week, become a more proficient squatter, but not overtrain myself in the meantime because I'm rotating my intensities. I'm taking that volume and I'm spreading it out throughout the week. I'm changing the adaptation that I'm going at after. So that can help me to essentially get maybe a little bit stronger or develop that lift faster because I can do it more often because I'm manipulating the intensity.
Does that mean you specialize in that one movement and then maintenance for the other two?
Yes and no. So a lot of it boils down to, and like what you'll see is like common between the 3 lifts. Bench is obviously the easiest to recover from, right? It's not that you don't use your lower body at all on the bench press, but in terms of the loads that are actually being lifted and the musculature that's used, you can bounce back from a heavy bench press faster than you can a squat and a deadlift, right? So with that being said, bench frequency tends to be higher in a program like that. 3 times a week is not uncommon, maybe 4 if they're really trying to specialize on something for a shorter period of time. Squat is one of those, obviously it depends on how much you squat, but you can recover a little faster than at least a deadlift, maybe not as much as a bench press. So that kind of like 2 and or sometimes even 3 if somebody really needs it on like a squat is common. Deadlift though is one of those that like no matter how much you like it, it's just more taxing on your nervous system. You just can't bounce back as fast. So typically you see like once to twice a week on your deadlift. So once you kind of like set this frequency, now you kind of like spread this out on your training split, however you're gonna mix this up. And you'll have certain days where maybe you're hitting multiple compound lifts in a day. Maybe you're benching and squatting in the same day and then some accessories and whatever, right? Like a lot of this is just, let me figure out my priorities and what need to happen. And then I'll layer in the rest with how much time, recovery ability, needs, things like that I have. And then I'll fill in the rest. So with that being said, you can really push kind of all 3 lifts sort of simultaneously. I do think at a certain point when you're a little bit more advanced, like sometimes you kind of got to like pick a little bit. If we're talking powerlifting, like out of the 3 lifts, like what's the lift that you need the most work on? What do we need to shore up to get your total movement on whatever? And now the focus can be shifted towards that, whether it be in the frequency, the number of days that we hit the lift, whether it be in the loads or whatever else that we've deemed that individual needs more work. So for example, if I have a lifter that's already a strong squatter, they squat a lot of weight already. And because of that, it takes them longer to recover from a squat session because they are so strong and whatever. Maybe I only need them squatting like 1 heavy-ish squat session a week and then 1 more to just grease the groove. Maybe that's for speed. Maybe it's a front squat or something that I can't lift as much weight anyways, but it gives me another squat pattern. And then deadlift. They're a pretty strong deadlifter, but they're a better squatter. So maybe we pepper in a couple deadlift, days. But bench is where we really need to bring our total up. They're really strong lower body, but bench, we just got to get some work in there. Now, I may have 3 days and maybe more of my accessories on, those days are more bench focused, chest, shoulders, triceps, and so you can pepper in the rest of your exercise selection, filling in those gaps with things that focus on where you need to focus. But essentially, in a model like that, you are taking similar lifts, similar movement patterns, and increasing the frequency because you're manipulating the intensity, if that makes sense.
That's a lot of volume.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, you got to check it. Again, you got to know who you're talking about. Typically, lifters that have a lower training age, and I want to hesitate how I say this, females can typically handle more volume. Again, a lot of this boils down to, with most beginners, it's the training age, but it's also the body type, the body weight, right? It's the same thing for females. Why can you handle more volume or workload? Maybe because you're not as strong yet, or the loads that you're lifting aren't as great. There's a lot of really, really strong female lifters, So it's not taking anything away from that. But maybe this female lifter that's really, really strong is 165, 170 pounds. That might be a pretty good size for a female, but for a guy, that's not that big. When you got a guy that's 300 pounds is squatting 800 pounds, it's just going to take him longer to recover by nature of he just bigger, more load on his nervous system, right? So with that being said, a beginner, that may work well for them. You're going to squat multiple days a week. You're going to learn how to squat fast because we do it a lot. You see this a lot with Olympic weightlifting. You squat and squat and squat and squat and squat. It gets you kind of up to snuff pretty quick and not even thinking or second guessing about squatting. You front squat, you back squat. When you clean, you catch a squat. You just squat all the time. And in some sports, that's how you're going to make it. So that type of template may work really well for somebody that is in a sport like that or just needs that kind of frequency to get proficient with it. But somebody that maybe is very, very strong, or a very large individual, or maybe even somebody that is not as in shape and conditioned, they may only be able to tolerate certain lifts and certain intensities so often. You'll get some guys that are just, they're so big, they're so strong, they can only really deadlift any appreciable weight once every other week. Cause it's dude, I'm pulling 800-900 pounds. I do this and I'm trash for the rest of the week. I have to, this is where the periodization comes in.
Do you know Jackie Black?
Yeah.
So she said the same thing in one of in a podcast, and I clipped that. And she didn't get ratioed, but there was a lot of guys. I guess it hurt their ego because she said women recover faster than men.
A lot of studies have been done on it, and to be honest with you, a lot of it is controlled for body weight. When you break it down to just a even ratio to body mass, muscle mass, things like that, because we know that with females too, that men tend to run a little bit leaner in terms to comparatively to a female. Females need that, hormones and so on and so forth. That's normal. But because of that ratio to, fat to lean muscle mass ratio, but with all things basically even. So if you get an individual that is, 100 pounds of lean body mass, let's take it as a female, and then add whatever fat mass onto it, but 100 pounds lean body mass, and you get a male that's 100 pounds lean body mass. Now we've kind of made it even, and now you should start to see is they're recovering at about the same point. But most times when we look at male to female, oh yeah, this guy, it takes Clint, 7 days to recover from a heavy deadlift session or whatever, because Clint weighs however much. But this girl, she's back to it, in a few days. Well, how much does she weigh? How much does she pull in relation to her body weight? That's what we're talking about, really. So, but again, how you set up that athlete's program should account for a lot of those things. This is where I think people kind of get a little bit funny about like the cookie cutter type programs and the systems and stuff like that, because it doesn't necessarily account for those things. Well, what if I could do more volume? What if whatever? Again, just in my opinion, no matter if it's the most complicated training program system out there or something very, very basic, like a program is a guideline. It's not the Bible, it's not written in stone. It's to keep you on track, focused, and basically spelling out your intent that you've already decided on day in and day out to make sure that you get to that place. Sometimes you got to call adjustments. Sometimes you get in there and your program said 5x5 at X percentage, and you're getting in there and you're like, yo, this is not the business. This is not happening right now. You know, you talk about Mark earlier. I remember Mark coming out of a big competition, and by this point, he's getting strong, 800-pound squat. You know, just he's really getting strong. But I told him, I was like, being strong is cool, but it's gonna come back to bite you later, because now just not only did your 1 rep maxes went up, everything's going up. And he's coming out of a competition. I'm like, yo, okay, 65, 70%. That's normal. I'm taking it down from 100%. This is lightweight for him. Let's get a little volume, 4x6, 5x5. I get a text message from him. Bro, are you serious right now? What? What's the matter, man? I like, this is too much. What do you mean, man? It's only 65, 70%. Bro, you got me 4 sets of 6 at 600 pounds on this squat. Like, I could do one, but like I'm huffing and puffing. I can't keep up at that point. But yet, I got my, girl over here who's 140 something pounds, that's like taking 5x5 at 70%. Like, oh, this is easy. Like, do you want me to do some more sets? And I'm like, what's going on? Yeah, my man over here is 300 pounds. Like, he's sucking wind. He's really, really strong, but that volume, that ability to be able to recover, like, it's different, because look at the difference in total body weight, muscle mass. How much weight is that in relation to body weight? Like, things like that. And then it starts to be a little bit more even. Also, too, you find that too with, like, honestly, age kind of factors into that a little bit too. When I've got masters lifters who are 40, 50, 60, some masters lifters I've had pushing 70. I remember one lady I worked with, 67, 68. They're not going to bounce back like a 20-year-old. So a system like undulating periodization, squatting 3 times a week, that's not going to fly. You're going to crush a 60-something-year-old trying to do that.
Now, Jackie said she does a scissor periodization for her. So it's just like they're deloading almost every week. Yeah. Every other week.
Yep, exactly. And they have to, in order to keep it rolling. And remember, like we talked about from the beginning, the name of the game is consistency. Chop wood and carry water over and over and over. How do you do that when you're 60 years old and maybe you've been training for 40 years? Well, hey, I scissor my, my periodization. I go heavy one week and light the next weekend. Or some people say, hey, I go heavy on this lift one week and then light on the rest of the stuff. And I rotate. Like, there's always some way where the people that find a way to keep doing it, they adjusted it so that way they can keep going. But at some point, how you train at, these individuals that we got, how they're training at 60 is not how they trained at 20. And they shouldn't have been, right? There's a reason why we're doing all this stuff. So yeah, to that point, know who you're working with. Know their training history. Know, because those things matter. Like, how much volume can they handle? How long does it take them to bounce back after a heavy session? Those kind of things are all, important. You can get a lot of, data on that. It's 2025, so you can nerd out over all that kind of stuff, doing, wearables and getting into all that kind of stuff. But at some point, it kind of boils down some to like common sense, and then work your program, right? These programs that are spanning in like training blocks of like 4 to 8 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, like whatever. That's like the sweet spot typically, that like you can do something for that amount of period of time, progress with it in some form, whether it's volume or intensity or like what are you doing with it, see some results. But then after that, you gotta switch it up. You gotta, what's the next thing? Where are we going from here to here? Because at some point, your body is going to stop responding to that stimulus. And, you know, just like we talked about, this is why you've got different types of training programs and periodization and exercises. And you notice some of these programs that are like, what would people consider more advanced, West Side and whatever. Obviously, they did it for geared powerlifters, and there's other reasons, but even just sometimes the complexity of some of the exercises. Okay, well, you got a safety bar, box squat with this tempo with bands. Like, there's a lot of stuff. Yeah, but for somebody that's trained the better part of 20 years and has squatted like every single week, multiple times a week for years, like, you got to throw something different out there. You keep throwing the same thing and your body's like, already seen it. Nope, not interested. Right. So, you know, again, the training program, everything should be kind of like catered to that lifter, that athlete, and helping them to progress. Now, at some point, does that mean that everybody needs to be running around with this, you know, super tailored and complex program and, oh, I'm special and I do this and not that? No. Like, a lot of people need a lot of the same baseline core things. Like, foundationally, most people, most sports are going to require certain things. Like, if you can't do this in this capacity, you can't do it in another one. Like, there's this general foundation. But then outside of that, that's when, you know, it can start branching out, right? Like, if you don't power lift, can you still squat, bench, and deadlift? Yeah, sure. You just don't have to max out, right? So you're just general gym going, and I do some squats, and I do some bench press, and I do some deadlifts. And you know what? I'm not necessarily doing strongman, but I throw some carries in there, and my gym's got some machines. So I do, you know, some machines, kind of like a bodybuilder. Mix it in, mix it up. If you're not doing anything like specific, but eventually you get to a point to like when you need it, I want to do this competition. I want to zero in on this goal, that goal, whatever. Now, the training just shifts.